I've spent all day wondering what Sherrilyn Ifill thinks about all of this. She never holds back. She has lots of brilliant thoughts. She's the former president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She's now the Vernon Jordan Distinguished Professor in Civil Rights at Howard Law School. And you've said, we've talked about this case before, you've said, quote, Section 3 was enacted for such a time as this and for such a figure as President Trump. And you've reflected on history, which is so powerful. What was your reaction to the court decision today?
Well, I wasn't surprised, Jen, at the outcome, at the judgment, that we had talked about this before, as you said at the top of the hour, that the court would be looking for an off-ramp. I was extremely disappointed in the oral argument, in part because many of the justices seem unprepared. This was a case in which there were many amicus briefs that were filed. There were complicated arguments. This was a case in which we don't have a lot to go on in terms of precedent, because fortunately, until 2020, we had not experienced a federal insurrection. So I expected that the court was going to seek an off-ramp, and I thought the off-ramp would be kind of what it was, which is that they were not going to allow one state to remove Trump from the ballot. I think what is disturbing is the overreach. And here I'm going to have to disagree with you a little bit. I hesitate to do so because we're in sync with the Green.
You're a legal expert. I welcome your disagreement, please.
Well, I think I even disagree with other legal experts on this. I am not at all encouraged by the fact that the court did not say something about whether or not Trump, in fact, engaged in insurrection. It was very clear from the argument they had no intention of touching it. They had no intention of reviewing the factual premise of the Colorado Supreme Court's decision, and they seemed even disdainful of involving themselves in the stickiness of the actual factual question as to whether or not Trump had participated in insurrection. But what they did do was that they overreached. And even though this was a unanimous judgment, I think the takeaway from this opinion today is the brawl that is clearly happening on this Supreme Court. We have three justices, Justice Sotomayor, Justice Kagan, and Justice Jackson, who seem to be concurring, but it was a pretty harsh concurrence. This is a case, they said, that cried out for judicial restraint, and they used their concurrence to talk about the failure of this court to exercise restraint. Jen, the court went beyond what they needed to do, not only in terms of President Trump, but remember that they also talked about the need for Congress to pass legislation. They described precisely what the congressional action has to be. Then they described the legislation itself, that it has to be tailored to Section 3. And I think this really outraged the three justices who wrote that concurrence. This was not a question that had been factually developed or even legally developed in this case, because it wasn't at issue in this case, but they reached out to do it. And it's kind of, I think, shocking and important for the three concurring justices to say that they did it in order to insulate, they said, this court and the petitioner, that is President Trump, from future controversy. They also said, the three concurring justices, that that the decision today insulates all alleged insurrectionists from future challenges to their holding federal office. And that's important, Jen, because, you know, there were 10 members of Congress, actually one was a representative-elect, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who met with Trump on December 10th. And some of us have been keeping a running list of members of Congress who were involved or believed to have been involved in the plans to overturn the election. Trump is not the only fish in this ocean. And the Supreme Court seemed to go further afield, not only to protect Trump into the future, but also to protect others. And then, of course, there's this concurrence from Amy Coney Barrett, the other conservative on the court, who writes a kind of plaintive, very short concurring opinion, which demonstrates what she clearly had hoped for, was that this court would be unanimous, that the 5 members would restrain themselves from going further than the 3 concurring justices wanted to, and that they could have spoken with one voice in a way that, as she would describe it, would bring the temperature down. And it's clear to me that from her concurrence, she was disappointed that the other five conservative justices, the 5 male conservative justices, somehow were unable to exercise the restraint that might have resulted in a true unanimous judgment and opinion in this case. I think this is very revealing to us about what's going on that court. I think when the historical record is written, when seats are added to the Supreme Court, as they invariably will be, this will be part of the record of what was happening and what even justices on the court were prepared to say is the overreach of the conservatives on this court. So this is a decision that we expected as it relates to Mr. Trump.
Yeah.
Its overreach is disturbing as it relates to other insurrectionists. And as it relates to the court encroaching on what they believe Congress must do, but also it's very revealing about what is going on this Supreme Court, and it's very contentious.
I mean, when you look at how revealing this is, and please disagree with me anytime, I welcome your viewpoints and also I welcome your brilliance. When you look at that, and we're looking, because we're all waiting, this immunity case, they're not going to start hearing arguments until April. How do you read, we can't predict what they're going to do, but how do you assess or read this ruling today in terms of how they might approach cases related to Trump moving forward?
I'm actually, this is why I'm spending so much time parsing the words of the concurring justices, because I think they're speaking in Morse code to us. I think they are telling us something, and they're telling us something that is very disturbing, which is that, I mean, when they say it is an attempt to insulate all alleged insurrectionists, that's a pretty loaded thing for fellow justices to say on the court, and that the court attempts to insulate itself and the petitioner from further controversy. So I think this idea of reading the tea leaves as though there's any chance that this court is going to rule in a way that does not allow Mr. Trump to go forward, even the immunity case, obviously they could have decided that case on an expedited basis, as they were asked to do by Jack Smith. They didn't do so. They could have left intact the Court of Appeals decision. They didn't do so. They've created a schedule that I think is going to make things very, very difficult. And so I think the idea that the Supreme Court is going to be some form of salvation here is not a sound one. We don't have any reason to believe that. But I do think that we should be independently concerned as a matter of democracy about what is breaking down on the United States Supreme Court, and that their actions would be cast in this way by their three colleagues who were united in that assessment of what's going on, and joined not in that in how far that concurrence went, but joined in the disappointment and dissatisfaction by Amy Coney Barrett, who also clearly would have preferred that the court not engage in this kind of overreach that would set off this kind of fracture. That means that she knows that there are legitimacy issues as well as Americans view what the court is doing. So I think that's, for me, the biggest takeaway from this decision today. And I think it's independently alarming, and we should be paying attention to that as well.
Always read the dissent. That is my shorthand summary, and always watch what the court is doing.
The concurrence, it's a concurrence.
The concurrence, yeah.
It purports to be a concurrence in this case, so you got to read it all.
You got to read it all. Thank you, Sherrilyn Ifill. Always appreciate having you on and talking to you and hearing your brilliance.